The day Mason Webb's $180,000 degree meant absolutely nothing. He was standing in a field watching a 73-year-old man with mud on his boots and no diploma on his wall save an entire crop from a disease that Mason hadn't even seen coming. He'd spotted the blight first. Reached straight for the textbook answer: spray the whole field, copper fungicide, standard protocol. Earl Combs looked at him the way you look at someone who just told you the sky is green. And the fingerling? Mason had forgotten it. The only potato of its kind left on Earth, and the man with the master's degree had left it off his list. That moment cost him something he couldn't name yet. Not his pride, that had been gone for weeks. Something deeper. The comfortable certainty that knowing about a thing and understanding it were the same. They weren't. And in Harlan County, Kentucky, that difference could bury you, or if you were lucky enough, if you were stubborn enough to keep showing up after every humiliation, it could finally teach you what a classroom never could. The alarm on Mason Webb's phone went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before he'd set it, because he'd barely slept. He lay on the narrow mattress in the spare bedroom of his Aunt Carol's house in Harlan County, Kentucky, staring at water stains on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere he'd never been, listening to a rooster he couldn't see announce the arrival of a day he wasn't sure he was ready for. The mattress had a spring that pressed into his lower back if he shifted left, and he'd been shifting left all night. He was 29 years old. He had a master's degree in agricultural science from Purdue University, a thesis titled Optimizing Yield Efficiency in Solanum tuberosum through Precision Soil Amendment Protocols that his thesis advisor Dr. Halloran had called genuinely impressive work. Mason, the kind of foundation a serious career gets built on. He had a LinkedIn profile with a professional headshot taken in a Walgreens photo booth in Indianapolis, 3 peer-reviewed publications, 2 of them as lead author, and a skills section that listed GIS mapping, soil spectral analysis, integrated pest management, cultivar selection protocols, and precision agriculture systems. He had a letter of recommendation from Dr. Halloran that used the phrase exceptional analytical capacity twice in 2 pages. What he did not have was a job. The USDA field office position in Indianapolis had gone to a woman named Dr. Christine Farley, who had a PhD from Cornell and 6 more years of experience and who was, from everything Mason could find online, genuinely more qualified. He told himself he was not bitter about this and mostly believed it. The agricultural consultancy in Louisville had hired him on a 4-month contract that had not been renewed, and the project manager there, a man named Brendan who wore fleece vests indoors, had told him in the exit meeting that his academic orientation was a poor fit for client-facing work, which was the kind of sentence that stayed with you. The University Extension program in Bloomington had been genuinely interested, 2 rounds of interviews, a campus visit, lunch with the department chair, until the state legislature cut the program's budget by 30% and the position was eliminated before it was filled. So here he was. His parents had driven him to Harlan County in his father's truck with 2 boxes of his things, and his mother had hugged him for a long time at Carol's front door, and his father had shaken his hand and said, with the particular care of a man choosing words, "This is a good place to regroup." Not a defeat. A regrouping. Mason had nodded and carried his boxes to the spare room and lain down on the mattress and found the spring and stared at the water stains until he fell asleep. Carol Webb was 58, small and wiry, with calloused hands and a directness that had no malice in it. She'd been widowed 4 years ago when her husband Ray had a heart attack in the barn, and she'd been running the farm alone since then, 11 acres, a vegetable garden, some chickens, a herd of 8 goats that she sold milk to a local cheese operation. It was not a large farm. It was not a prosperous farm. It was a farm that worked because Carol Webb worked it, starting before dawn and stopping after dark, without complaint or celebration. She gave Mason coffee at 6 in the morning and looked at him over her mug with eyes that had the quality of eyes that had seen things and kept going. "There's a man I want you to meet," she said. "His name is Earl Combs. He farms about 3 miles down the road. Been farming this county since before your mother was born." "What does he grow?" "Potatoes, mostly. Some corn, some beans. But his whole life has been potatoes." Mason wrapped his hands around the mug. "I know potatoes," he said. His thesis was on potatoes. He'd spent 4 years studying potatoes with a focus and depth that had narrowed his social life to a radius of about 30 feet from the agricultural science building. Carol looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely decode. "I know you know about potatoes," she said, gently, which was a different sentence from the one he'd said, and they both knew it, and she didn't push it further. Earl Combs lived at the end of a road that went from asphalt to gravel to packed dirt in stages, as if the pavement had simply lost interest and given up. His farm sat in a shallow valley between two ridges, the kind of place that held morning fog until nearly 10 and smelled of creek water and turned earth even in dry weather. The farmhouse was white clapboard, 2 stories, with a porch that sagged on the left side and had been sagging, Mason would later learn, for approximately 40 years without anyone doing a thing about it. The barn behind the house was older than the house and in considerably better shape. Earl was standing at the edge of his near field when Carol's truck pulled up. He wasn't doing anything visible, just standing there, looking at something that to Mason's eye was simply a field of potato plants in the pale morning, and the looking itself had a quality of intensity that made Mason slow his walk toward him. Earl Combs was 73 years old and looked simultaneously older and more capable than that. He was tall, or had been. Decades of bending over rows had taken an inch or two and given him a slight forward lean that was not a stoop but a posture, as if he were permanently attentive to something below his eye level. His hands were the first thing you noticed after his face. They were large in a structural way, like they had been designed for specific work and had spent 50 years fulfilling their design. His face was weathered past the point where weather is visible as damage and into the point where it becomes simply the face, the permanent record of an outdoor life. He turned when he heard them and walked over with the unhurried pace of a man who has never needed to hurry to get where he was going. "Earl, this is my nephew Mason," Carol said. "The one with the agricultural degree." Earl looked at Mason with the direct gray-eyed gaze of someone who has no patience for performance. "The one with the degree," he said, as if confirming something he'd already been told. "Mason Webb." Mason extended his hand. Earl shook it. His grip was neither aggressive nor soft, precisely as firm as it needed to be, which was itself a kind of statement. "Carol says you know potatoes." "I wrote my thesis on potato yield optimization. Cultivar selection, soil amendment strategies, disease resistance protocols, precision application of." "Last time you dug a potato out of the ground," Earl said. Not a question, a prompt. Mason paused. "I've done extensive field research." "With your hands?" Earl's gaze was patient and unmoving. "Last time you put your hands in the dirt and pulled a potato out?" A crow called from somewhere on the ridge. The fog was still on the lower end of the field. "My undergraduate field practicum," Mason said. 3-4 years ago." Earl nodded in a way that indicated he was filing the information. "Come back this afternoon if you want. I'll be in the south field after 2. He turned and walked back toward wherever he'd been standing, and Mason watched him go and felt something he recognized clearly as irritation and something else he didn't quite have a name for yet. In the truck, Carol drove a full mile before she said, "He's not being rude." "I know," Mason said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "He's been burned," Carol said. "University extension people come through, agricultural consultants, government program people. They look at his operation and they see inefficiency. They tell him what he's doing wrong. They leave. He keeps farming the same way he's farmed for 50 years. She glanced at him. "He doesn't assume anymore that a person with credentials knows what they're talking about. You'll have to show him." "Show him what?" "That you can listen," Carol said. "That's usually the thing." Mason went back that afternoon. The south field was 4 acres of gently sloping ground, and Earl was moving along the rows slowly, crouching every few feet, doing something close to the soil with his hands. Mason walked out and crouched nearby, watching. "What are you checking for?" "Blight pressure." Earl lifted a leaf and showed him the underside. There was a faint discoloration at the margin, barely visible, the kind of early sign Mason had seen only in textbook photographs, never in a real field in real light. Started on the low end overnight. Came in on the humidity. Mason looked at the leaf, and a response formed immediately: spray a preventative copper fungicide across the whole field, get ahead of the spread before it could establish. It was what the protocol said. It was what the textbooks recommended. It was the right answer. "You could spray the full field," he said. "Preventative copper application, get ahead of it before." "What would that do to the Kennebec block on the ridge?" Earl asked. He didn't say it as a challenge. He said it with the genuine curiosity of someone who wants to know whether the person he's talking to has thought it through. Mason thought. Kennebecs were blight tolerant, copper tolerant, generally robust. Kennebecs are fairly tolerant of copper application. "In the short term," Earl said. He put the leaf down gently, precisely. "I've got Kennebecs on that ridge ground that Margaret's father planted in 1971. The soil biology up there took 40 years to get to where it is. The mycorrhizal networks in that soil are what make that variety work the way it works on that specific slope. You apply copper repeatedly across those 4 acres and you start degrading those networks. Not this year. Maybe not next year. But you start. He stood up with the slow care of a man who has learned to respect his joints. So you don't spray the whole field. You spot treat the low end where the pressure is and you leave the rest alone. Mason said nothing. He was doing what he did when someone told him something he should have known, reviewing whether he had known it, in the abstract, in theory, in the literature, and the answer was yes, he had known it, and the follow-up question was why he hadn't said it, and the answer was uncomfortable. He had seen the problem and reached automatically for the largest, most comprehensive solution available, without stopping to ask whether the field needed a comprehensive solution or a specific one. Your aunt says you're looking for work, Earl said, moving to the next row. I'm looking for the right position, Mason said. What kind of money does the right position pay? Mason told him a number. Earl made a sound, not dismissive, not a laugh, more like the sound of someone registering a fact about the world that doesn't surprise them. I clear about 40,000 in a good year, Earl said. After expenses. Some years considerably less. With more sophisticated market positioning you could. I sell to the same 12 restaurants and 4 farmers markets I've sold to for 20 years, Earl said. They buy everything I grow. Some of those restaurants charge $15 a pound for my fingerlings. My yield per acre is about a third of what a commercial operation would get from this ground. He paused. And my soil gets better every year. A commercial operation runs the same ground hard for 10 years and the yield starts dropping because they've mined out the biology. My yield goes up, maybe 0.5% a year, steady. And my inputs are low because the soil is doing most of the work. He looked at Mason sidelong. I don't know what you'd call that in your thesis. Around here I just call it not eating your seed corn. Mason didn't have an immediate answer. They worked along the row in the afternoon quiet, and he noticed that working alongside Earl felt different from what he'd expected. There was no performance to it, no instruction being delivered, just 2 people moving through a field and one of them paying attention to everything the field said. I can help you, Mason said, after a while. I mean that. There are things I know that could be useful. I don't doubt it, Earl said, and his tone was neither warm nor cold, just level. Question is whether you can learn anything. He glanced at Mason briefly. Come back tomorrow morning if you want. 6 o'clock. Mason came back at 6 the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Earl didn't invite him exactly, he simply stopped seeming surprised when Mason appeared, which Mason took as permission. For the first 2 weeks, Earl gave him physical work that was largely wordless, mulching, moving compost from the pile to the lower field, repairing a section of deer fence on the north border where something had pushed through. Mason did these things with the diligence of someone who understood they were being evaluated and was determined not to fail, and Earl observed the work and said almost nothing about it, which was itself a kind of assessment. What Mason did not anticipate was the social dimension of arriving in Harlan County with a graduate degree and no visible occupation. He went to Whitaker's feed store for the first time on a Wednesday morning in his second week, buying supplies Carol needed. Whitaker's had been in the same building since 1952 and smelled of mineral supplements, motor oil, and something else, an older smell underneath, animal and vegetable and earth, the smell of a place that had been a connection point for farming lives for decades. The owner, a man named Jim Whitaker who was the second Jim Whitaker to run the store, greeted Mason without particular warmth and without particular coldness, the neutral courtesy of commerce. 2 men came in while Mason was paying. They looked at him in the way of people who know every face in a room and are cataloging a new one. One of them was heavy-set, somewhere in his mid-50s, wearing a John Deere cap so worn the logo had faded to a ghost of itself. The other was thinner, younger, with the look of someone related to the first. You're Carol Webb's nephew, the heavy-set one said. It wasn't a question. Mason Webb. Yeah. He put out his hand. The man shook it after a pause that was a beat too long. Dale Whitfield. I farm about 400 acres up on Route 7. He said 400 acres the way you'd say it to someone you wanted to have a particular sense of your standing. Heard you're spending time out at Earl Combs' place. That's right. Learning to farm? The question was framed as simple curiosity and delivered as something more pointed. Learning whatever he'll teach me, Mason said. Dale glanced at the other man, his brother-in-law Gary. Mason would learn, with an expression that carried a communication Mason was not included in. Earl does things his own way, Dale said. Always has. Nothing wrong with it, it's just, not exactly what you'd call a modern operation. A pause. No offense, but a man with a master's degree spending his summer hand-picking bugs off a 4-acre potato patch, people find that a little hard to understand. I'm not hand-picking bugs, Mason said. I'm learning soil management systems that have produced consistent yield improvement for 50 consecutive years on ground that most commercial operations would have exhausted in 15. Gary made a small sound. Dale put 2 fingers on the brim of his cap, a gesture that might have been conciliatory and might not have been. Well, he said. Good luck with it. He moved past Mason to talk to Jim Whitaker, and Mason paid for his supplies and walked to his truck and sat for a moment doing a controlled breathing exercise his former therapist in Indianapolis had taught him, which he wouldn't have admitted to anyone in that building, or in that county, or possibly anywhere. It got worse before it got better. The diner on Main Street, Maze, which had the best biscuits Mason had ever eaten and coffee that was very bad but which he drank every time because the biscuits justified the trip, had a table near the back where a group of local farmers met every Thursday morning. Mason had been going to the diner twice a week, and the table was placed in a way that made it possible to hear their conversation from the window seat where he usually sat, if they weren't keeping their voices down. Sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't. He heard his name twice. The first time was a simple identification, Carol Webb's nephew, the one staying out at Earl's, delivered neutrally. The second time was not neutral. He caught fragments, thinks he's going to come in here with his degree and tell people who've been farming this ground their whole lives, and, attitude people get when they've never actually had to make a living from, and then Gary's voice, recognizable now, saying something Mason didn't catch that made 2 of the others laugh. He stayed in his seat and ate his biscuit and looked out the window at Main Street and thought about his years in academic environments where different people had made different comments in the same not quite directed register, about the kid from rural Ohio who'd shown up at the departmental dinner not knowing which fork to use, who'd worn the wrong kind of shoes to the conference, who'd asked questions that were too basic in the first seminar and too advanced in the second, and about how the architecture of that kind of social exclusion was always the same regardless of the setting. Comments designed to be heard but not quite addressed, the creation of a boundary through performance rather than statement, the maintenance of an inside that you were carefully, consistently, let know you were outside of. He mentioned it to Carol that evening, more casually than he felt. She was quiet for a moment, cutting an apple at the kitchen counter. People here have seen a lot of outside ideas come through, she said. Government programs, university extensions, consultants from Louisville and Lexington. Most of them came with solutions to problems they hadn't actually understood. Left when the solution didn't work, or when the funding ran out. The land and the people were still here. She set down the knife. That's not an excuse for bad manners. But it's a context. I know the context, Mason said. It doesn't make it less frustrating. No, Carol agreed. It doesn't. She put the apple slices on a plate and slid it toward him. Keep showing up at Earl's, that's the thing that'll matter. Not your degree, not your arguments. Just showing up, doing the work, not quitting when it's uncomfortable. She looked at him. You haven't quit yet. It's been 3 weeks. 3 weeks is 3 weeks, she said. Some of the people who came through here with plans didn't last 3 days. Mason ate an apple slice and thought about that. The next morning at Whitaker's, he went back, because he needed supplies and because not going back would have been a statement he wasn't willing to make. Dale was there again, alone this time, loading bags of feed supplement into his truck. He glanced at Mason when Mason came in and then looked away, and for a moment Mason thought that was how it was going to be. Then Dale said, without looking up from the bags, you know anything about soil pH management for heavy clay ground? Mason stopped. Depends on what you're growing. Corn. Northeast Field's been running low yields for 3 seasons. Had the extension office test it, they said lime application, I've limed it twice and it hasn't moved. Mason thought. Did they test for compaction? Heavy clay at low pH can lock up after repeated liming if you've got compaction issues. The lime adjusts the chemistry, but if the physical structure is compromised the roots can't access the nutrients anyway. You'd want to look at deep tillage to break the compaction layer before the next lime application, and probably a cover crop to start building organic matter. Dale had stopped loading and was looking at him now. The extension office didn't mention compaction. They might have been working from a standard protocol. Compaction diagnosis usually requires a penetrometer reading or a manual assessment. Did they do either? Just the soil test, Dale said. He had the expression of someone being given information that costs him something, not the information itself, which was useful, but the source of it, which complicated things. All right, he said after a moment. I'll look into it. He picked up another bag. You could stop by sometime if you want. Have a look at the field. It was not an invitation exactly. It was the beginning of something that wasn't yet an invitation. Mason went to Dale's Northeast Field the following Saturday. The field was 8 acres of heavy clay soil on a slight north-facing slope, and Mason spent an hour on it with a borrowed penetrometer in his hands and what he was slowly learning to understand about soil through touch, the way it compressed, the way it gave or didn't give, the temperature differential between surface and depth. The compaction layer was pronounced, starting at about 8 inches and running to 14, exactly where root development would be most impaired. He wrote up his findings in a 2-page summary and left it in Dale's mailbox. Dale called Carol's house 2 days later and asked to speak to Mason. "Your compaction analysis was right," he said. "I had a soil scientist from the University of Kentucky come out and confirm it. He said the same thing you said." A pause. "You've done this before?" "Soil diagnosis was part of my graduate program. I've done field assessments for research projects." A silence. "You charge for that kind of consultation?" "I'm not set up for consulting right now," Mason said. "I'm doing documentation work with Earl Combs." "Earl Combs," Dale said, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Not warm, but not dismissive either. Something between them that hadn't been there before. At Earl's farm, the education was rarely formal and almost never announced. It happened in the doing of things, Earl working and Mason either working alongside him or watching, with conversation arising from the work rather than preceding it. One morning Earl handed Mason a handful of soil from 3 different locations on the farm and told him to describe what he felt. Not the chemistry. Not the texture classification on the USDA soil texture triangle, which was what Mason's hands automatically reached for. What he actually felt. Mason tried. He struggled. His hands had been educated about soil through test results and data outputs and classification systems, and the direct sensory vocabulary, the feeling of living soil against dead soil, the particular give of good drainage, the way clay content expressed itself under pressure, was almost entirely absent. He knew a great deal about soil. His hands knew almost nothing. "You're trying to classify it," Earl said. "Stop classifying. Just feel it." "What am I trying to feel?" "That's not the right question. The right question is what your hands are telling you." Mason tried again. He closed his eyes, which felt faintly ridiculous, and tried to receive the sensation rather than process it, and what he noticed was that the 3 samples were different in ways that didn't have words yet. One of them had a particular give that the others didn't, a responsiveness, and one of them was subtly warmer, which he wouldn't have noticed if he'd been thinking about anything else. "The middle one," he said. "Something's different about it. It feels more," he searched for a word. "Alive." Earl looked at him. "That's the south field upper block. The best ground on this farm." He took the sample back. "The warmth you're feeling is biological activity. Microbial respiration generates heat. You can learn to feel the difference between soil with active biology and soil that's depleted. Takes practice. Takes years of practice." He handed Mason the samples back. "You'll practice." This was how things were taught. Not in lectures or demonstrations but in exercises whose purpose was often not explained until later, sometimes much later. Earl showed him the 3 springs on the property, their locations, their behavior across seasons, what each one's flow rate and character indicated about subsurface water movement. He showed him how to read the grass color in late afternoon to understand whether the water table in a particular spot had shifted. He explained cultivar placement not as a decision made by algorithm but as the result of 30 years of observation about what belonged where, this variety on the north slope because it handled late frost without the cellular damage that reduced quality, that one in the wet corner because its root architecture worked with the drainage rather than against it, another on the ridge because the particular mineral composition of that soil brought out a flavor quality that didn't occur anywhere else on the property. "Do you have a map of all this?" Mason asked. Earl tapped his temple. "You should write it down," Mason said. "If something happened to you." Earl was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that," he said, and something in his voice had a quality that made Mason look at him. "Been thinking about it more lately." He didn't elaborate, and Mason didn't push, but the statement stayed with him. The varieties themselves were something Mason hadn't encountered outside of historical agricultural literature. Earl grew 11 distinct types, most of them heirloom or heritage varieties that commercial agriculture had abandoned decades ago as insufficiently standardized, insufficiently high yield, insufficiently amenable to mechanical harvest. He had Lumper, the Irish variety, not out of sentiment, Earl said, but because on his specific north-facing slope it produced a waxy texture that no modern variety could replicate. He had German Butterball, obtained from a woman in western Pennsylvania whose grandmother had carried it from Bavaria. He had a fingerling variety with no recorded name. Earl called it the Harlan fingerling, because as far as anyone could determine it existed only in this valley, had been selected and saved by farming families since at least the 1880s, and had never been commercialized because it was too small, too irregular, and too physiologically particular to survive mechanical harvest. The Harlan fingerling was, by any commercial standard, ugly. It was mottled purple and cream, asymmetrical in ways that seemed almost deliberate, with a skin that wrinkled in storage and a growth habit that produced clusters rather than individual tubers, making hand harvest the only practical method. Earl grew it on the east corner of the south field where the soil had a particular mineral profile. He'd had it tested over the years. It was high in potassium and had a trace mineral balance that was specific to that corner and possibly to that valley. The fingerling, selected over generations by farmers who'd grown it in this specific ground, had over time become calibrated to that mineral profile in a way that made it perform here as it performed nowhere else. Mason understood this intellectually. Then Earl boiled 3 of them one afternoon and set them on the work table with butter and salt, and Mason ate one standing up, and stopped thinking about it intellectually. There was a nuttiness that lingered after the first bite, and a creaminess that was structural rather than fatty, and a flavor that arrived in stages, first the skin's earthiness, then something sweeter beneath it, then the nutty finish, that was unlike anything he'd eaten from a potato. He ate the second one more slowly. He stood there looking at the third one for a moment before eating it. "How long have you grown this variety?" he asked. "My father grew it." "His father grew it." "Before that I don't know." Earl ate his without ceremony. "A plant biologist from UK came out about 12 years ago. Very interested. Wanted samples, wanted to study the genetics. Said it was a unique germplasm resource, said it should be properly documented." He paused. "He also said the university could help commercialize it. Find a market, scale up production, create a registered variety name." A longer pause. "I told him I'd think about it." "And?" "Still thinking." Earl looked at Mason steadily. "The moment you register a variety and start commercializing it, it stops being what it is. People optimize for the market. They select for shelf life and shipping tolerance and uniformity. 20 years later you have something that's easier to sell and tastes like nothing." He drank his coffee. "I'm not saying that's wrong for every variety. I'm saying it would be wrong for this one." Mason thought about the flavor he'd just experienced and thought Earl was probably right, and also thought that Earl's position had a kind of complexity to it that he hadn't initially registered. It wasn't simply traditionalism or resistance to outside intervention. It was a specific analysis of what this specific variety needed, based on specific knowledge of what commercialization actually did to agricultural varieties over time. It was, Mason realized, a more sophisticated understanding of the problem than the plant biologist from UK had apparently brought with him. What if it could be documented without being commercialized? Mason said. Just the knowledge preserved. The genetics catalogued, the growing conditions mapped, the history recorded. So even if the farm changed hands, the information existed somewhere. Earl looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" he asked. It was a real question. Mason thought about it honestly. Because someone spent generations selecting that variety for this specific ground and the flavor that came out of it is genuinely extraordinary, and if all of that just disappears because there's no record of it, that's a real loss. Not just for agriculture. For people who will never know what they're missing. He paused. That's probably not the most scientific argument. No, Earl said. But it's the right one. He picked up his mug. Let me think about it. He thought about it for a week, and then one morning he took Mason into the root cellar. It was beneath the barn, accessible through a trapdoor, and Mason had known it existed but hadn't been inside it. When Earl opened the hatch and they went down the wooden steps into the cool dark and Earl found the light switch, what Mason saw made him stop at the bottom of the steps and stand still for a long moment. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and the shelves held jars, hundreds of jars, mason jars and canning jars and glass containers of various sizes, each one sealed and labeled. The labels were handwritten in 2 different hands. One hand was older, faded, the ink slightly brown, a woman's hand, Mason thought, careful and precise. The other was newer, less ornamented, clearly Earl's. On a table in the center of the room were notebooks, perhaps 30 of them, stacked in rough chronological order. The earliest was dated 1973. Margaret built this, Earl said from behind him. She started the year we got married. Kept it until she couldn't. He moved to the shelf on the left wall and ran one finger along a row of jars. Every variety we've ever grown is in here. Seed saved from the best specimens each year, documented with the conditions, the observations, anything that was unusual or notable. He pulled one jar from the shelf, a small one, with a purple cream label. Harlan fingerling. This jar is from 2018. This one, he reached to the shelf above, selected another, is from 1989. Margaret's label. Mason took the 1989 jar carefully. In the jar, half a dozen small seed potatoes, slightly shrunken with time. Margaret's label read, Harlan Fingerling, South Field East Corner, saved from largest cluster. Good color. Very good flavor this year, better than last. Note, planted 3 weeks later than usual due to late wet spring, did not seem to affect yield. Consider delaying plant date as standard practice. She was running an experiment, Mason said. Always was, Earl said. She never called it that. She just called it paying attention. Mason stood in the root cellar for a long time. He looked at Margaret's notebooks, didn't read them yet, that would come later, just looked at them, at the accumulated weight of what was contained in those pages. 30 years of paying attention to what grew in this valley, recorded in a careful hand by a woman who had no formal training in agricultural science and who had built, in a root cellar under a Kentucky barn, something that Mason would eventually understand was as sophisticated as anything he'd encountered in an academic context. I want to help you document this properly, he said. All of it. The variety maps, the soil records, the water patterns you carry in your head, Margaret's system expanded and made permanent. Not for commercial purposes. Just so it exists beyond, he stopped. Just so it exists. Earl was quiet in the dim light. The root cellar smelled of earth and cold and the particular dry sweetness of stored seed. All right, Earl said. All right. July arrived and the potato plants were at full canopy, the fields dense and electric green in the mornings, and the work shifted toward monitoring. Mason had gotten better at the physical work, not good, Earl's standard being what it was, but genuinely better, his hands developing some of the vocabulary they'd been missing. He'd gotten better, too, at the other kind of attention the farm required, the daily reading of dozens of small indicators that individually meant little but collectively constituted an understanding of how the season was developing. He was at the diner on a Thursday in mid-July when something at the back table shifted. He'd ordered his biscuits and coffee and sat at the window, and the usual assembly of farmers was at their usual table, and the conversation had the familiar texture that Mason had learned to tune out because tuning it in had not been doing him any good. But this time Roland Fraley, an older farmer who sat at the edge of the group and generally said less than the others, said something that caught Mason. Combs' documentation project, what that boy's doing with the seed library. Mason looked at his coffee cup and listened. My grandmother grew that potato, Roland was saying. The purple one. She called it the valley potato. Said it came down from her mother. I thought it was gone years ago. Someone else said something Mason didn't catch. Then Gary's voice, more carefully now, maybe he's not entirely wasting his time out there. A silence. Then Dale, deliberate and clear, evidently knowing Mason could hear, he did a soil diagnosis on my northeast field. Identified the compaction issue the extension office missed. UK confirmed it. Another pause. Man knows what he's doing. Mason kept looking at his coffee cup. His face was doing something he was trying to manage. He finished his breakfast and on the way out stopped at the table. 7 men looked up at him. He looked at Roland. I heard you mention the valley potato, Mason said. I think that's what Earl calls the Harlan Fingerling. We're documenting it. If you have any family records, letters, photographs, anything your grandmother wrote down, I'd like to see them. Roland looked at him for a moment. My grandmother kept a farm diary, he said slowly. Goes back to the 1920s. I don't know if it mentions varieties. It might, Mason said. Even just the name. Even just a description. It would help us trace the history. Roland nodded. I'll look for it. Mason left. Walking to his truck, he heard Dale's voice behind him, not loud, but not lowered either, told you he wasn't just another university kid. He sat in his truck for a moment and let that land where it needed to land. The blight came in the last week of July, not the early blight Mason and Earl had identified and spot treated in June, which they had managed with targeted copper application and which had not spread. This was Phytophthora infestans, late blight, the pathogen that had devastated the Irish potato crop in the 1840s, that had caused the deaths of 1 million people and the emigration of 1 million more, that agricultural science had spent a century trying to manage and that still moved through susceptible crops with a speed that was genuinely frightening once you understood what you were looking at. It came in on humidity. 5 days of warm nights and morning fog rolling in from the Ohio Valley, ideal conditions, the ideal the pathogen had been waiting for. Mason found the first lesions on a Tuesday morning, 3 plants at the south end of the south field, the characteristic water-soaked dark spots that would turn papery and white-bordered as the infection advanced, and that meant the sporangia were already dispersing on any air movement across the field. He called Earl from the field, which was something Earl had told him early on was acceptable in an emergency, and Earl came out in the old work truck within 15 minutes. He walked the field in the particular pattern Mason had observed him use when he needed to assess something at scale, not row by row but in a wider spiral, eyes working the full space of each section rather than the individual plants. He said nothing for a long time. Mason stayed quiet beside him, which he'd learned was the only useful thing to do when Earl was reading something. "It's in the Kennebec block on the ridge," Earl said finally. He was looking at the upper field, 100 yards away. "See the color at the east margin?" Mason looked. There was a slight darkening at the edge of the Kennebec planting that 3 months ago he would not have been able to see, and that now, after weeks of walking these fields at different times of day in different light conditions, he could identify as wrong, the particular wrong of early infection rather than the wrong of drought stress or nutrient deficiency. "We need to start immediately," Mason said. "What do you do?" Earl asked. It was the question he used when he wanted to understand Mason's thinking, not to correct it but to build on it. Mason worked through it aloud, quickly and specifically, which blocks were most susceptible and needed immediate hand removal of infected tissue, which were resistant enough to give them time, how to manage their movement through the fields to minimize their role as vectors, what organic fungicide application would address the spread without the systemic damage that broad copper application would cause to the mycorrhizal networks in the Kennebec block, whether the root cellar seed stock needed to be treated separately and how. He spoke for 4 minutes. Earl listened without interruption. "The Harlan fingerling," Earl said. Mason stopped. He had not mentioned it. The fingerling was on the east corner of the south field, the lowest yield block on the farm by volume, and his triage had organized itself around commercial output. Protect the highest yield blocks first, work outward. The fingerling had not come to the top of that calculation. "I didn't," he started. "It's the only variety of its kind in the world," Earl said. Not angry. "What does that change?" A moment of stillness in the infected field. "Everything," Mason said. "So tell me what we do for it first." They began at dawn the next morning and worked until dark. The work was specific and unrelenting, moving through the rows in a systematic pattern, removing infected tissue by hand and bagging it immediately to prevent further sporulation, applying targeted fungicide at infection margins with the kind of precision that meant working close to the ground for hours at a stretch. Mason's back and shoulders and hands were registering objections by noon of the first day that he ignored because the infection didn't care about his back. Earl worked with an economy of movement that Mason couldn't match but could learn from, the way he positioned his body, the way he read each plant quickly and made the removal decision without hesitation, the way he talked quietly as he worked, explaining what he was seeing and why he was making each choice, in the low even voice of someone who has been narrating their own work for decades and for whom the narration has become inseparable from the work itself. On the second day, Dale Whitfield's truck appeared at the edge of the field. Dale stood at the field boundary for a while, watching. Then, "You need help?" Earl looked up from a row. He looked at Dale for a moment. "Be useful," he said. Dale left and came back an hour later with Gary and Roland and a man named Henry whose farm was 2 miles east. They worked through the afternoon, doing what Earl directed without argument, with the quiet competence of men who knew agricultural work, and Mason watched how they watched Earl, the particular quality of the attention, the way they adjusted their technique when Earl corrected it, the complete absence of the skepticism they directed at Mason. This was a different kind of respect than Dale had shown at the feed store. This was the kind that didn't need to be performed because it had been established over decades and was simply there, like the soil. Late in the afternoon, Mason was working alongside Dale in the lower south block. The work was tedious and required sustained concentration, infected leaf after infected leaf, bag after bag, the monotony of crisis management. "I was wrong about you," Dale said. He was looking at the plant in front of him, not at Mason. "Things I said at the feed store. At the diner." A pause. Wasn't fair. Mason thought about the feed store, the too long pause before the handshake, the 400 acres delivered as a measurement, the conversation about garden plots while Gary watched. He thought about the diner table and the not quite directed comments he'd been meant to hear and had heard. "I heard most of it," Mason said. "I know." Dale moved to the next plant. "People here have seen a lot of outsiders with degrees and plans. Most of them didn't know what they were looking at. Didn't stay long enough to find out." He removed an infected leaf and sealed it in the bag with the practiced movement of a man who has done this before. "You stayed. You came back every day and did the work and didn't argue when Earl corrected you. That's different from most." "I had a lot to learn," Mason said. Still do, Dale said. Same as the rest of us. He said it without condescension, which was its own kind of shift. They worked until the light failed completely. Earl made soup, and they all sat around Earl's kitchen table, 7 men who'd spent a hard day in an infected field, and talked in the easy way of people who have done physical work together, which was different from every other kind of conversation Mason had had in Harlan County. Afterward, driving back to Carroll's in the dark, Mason tried to identify what had been different about it, and the best he could come up with was that no one had been positioning themselves. They'd just been talking. The blight was contained by the end of the 4th day. They lost about 18% of the total crop, painful, the difference between a good year and a difficult one, but the containment held. The Kennebec block on the ridge lost approximately a fifth of its plants, which Earl accepted with a grim equanimity that Mason recognized as the response of someone for whom losses are a condition of the work rather than a judgment on the worker. The Harlan Fingerling block came through completely clean. On the morning of the 5th day, they walked the fields in the early quiet, checking the perimeter of the containment zone one more time in the gold September light. You almost didn't account for the Fingerling, Earl said. Not accusatory, just factual. I know. Why? Mason had been thinking about this. I was doing triage based on yield volume. Economic value per acre. The Fingerling scores low on that metric. And that metric doesn't account for the fact that some things have value that isn't in the yield data. He paused. I knew that abstractly. I've known it since the first week I was here. But when I was actually in the field facing an actual crisis, I went back to the framework I'd been trained in. Earl walked in silence for a moment. That's honest, he said. It's also a problem, Mason said. It's a problem you've identified, Earl said. Identifying it is the beginning of fixing it. What would the fix be? Mason thought, building the other framework into the primary assessment. Not treating it as a secondary consideration that you layer in afterward. Making the question of irreplaceable value the first question, before the yield calculation. That's right, Earl said. It's a harder question to answer quickly. Takes practice. Takes years of knowing what's irreplaceable and what isn't. He looked at Mason. You're at the beginning of that knowledge. But you're at the beginning. That was the closest Earl Combs had come to a compliment. Mason received it and said nothing, and they walked on through the damp September field in the early light. Roland came to the farm 2 weeks later with his grandmother's farm diary. It was a composition book with a stiff cover that had softened with age, and the handwriting inside was in pencil, faded but legible, running from 1924 to 1951. Roland sat at Earl's kitchen table and turned the pages carefully while Mason watched, and in the entry for April 1934 they found it, planted the valley potatoes, east corner, same ground as always. Small and ugly, but nothing keeps better or tastes finer in November. The soil there suits them like they were born to it, which I suppose they were. Mason read it twice. He thought about a woman writing by lamplight in 1934 in the middle of the worst economic crisis in American history, taking the time to note a potato variety's flavor and its relationship to a specific piece of ground. She was born here? Mason asked Roland. Her mother was born here. Her grandmother came from Virginia, settled in the county in the 1870s. Roland turned another page. She was farming this county before anyone living was born. Mason looked at the entry again. The soil there suits them like they were born to it. This is documentation, he said. This is exactly the kind of historical record we need for the preservation project. Roland looked at him steadily. What's the preservation project? Mason explained. The seed library, Margaret's notebooks, the variety documentation, the plan to create a formal record of what existed in this valley that existed nowhere else. Roland listened with the attentiveness of someone being told something that concerns them directly. What do you need from me? Roland said. Permission to photograph the diary. And anything else your family has, letters, other diaries, photographs of the farm. We're trying to build a picture of the history of these varieties. The longer the documented record, the stronger the case for their preservation. He paused. And if you ever wanted to contribute to the seed library. I grow a white potato my grandmother called winter white, Roland said. Doesn't look like much, keeps all winter without sprouting, flavor gets sweeter with cold storage. I've grown it my whole life because she grew it. He looked at the diary. I always assumed someone else had it somewhere. Maybe not. Earl, who had been quiet at the other end of the table, said, bring me 3 seed potatoes next spring. We'll find out. The harvest came in October. It was entirely by hand, as it had always been at the Combs farm, which meant every potato from every acre was dug with a fork and placed in crates by people, not machines. Mason now knew every field and every variety and every reason each variety was where it was, and the knowledge changed the experience of the physical work in a way he hadn't anticipated. He knew what he was holding. Dale and Gary came for 2 days. Roland came for 2 days. Henry brought his son, who was 16 and had good hands and the willingness to work that Earl noticed and mentioned. Roland's winter white came out of the ground looking exactly like what Roland had described, plain and white and unremarkable, the kind of potato you'd pass in a farmer's market without slowing down. Earl held one for a long time before he put it in the crate. The Harlan fingerling came out of the east corner of the south field in its full improbable beauty. Purple and cream and knobbled, heaped in the crates, each one different from the others in the way that only things selected by nature over generations rather than optimized by commerce can be different. Mason harvested this block himself, moving slowly, handling each plant with a care that he didn't consciously decide on. It just happened, the knowledge of what these things were expressing itself through his hands. He was crouching over a cluster when he heard footsteps and looked up to find Dale standing at the edge of the block, looking at the crates. "That's the one you almost lost," Dale said. "Yeah." Dale crouched down beside him and picked up one of the fingerlings. Turned it in his hands. "Ugly little thing." "Wait until you taste it," Mason said. Dale put it back in the crate carefully, which surprised Mason a little. "Earl told me what it is," Dale said. "That it's the only one." He paused. "I didn't know there were things like that still out there." "Most people don't," Mason said. "That's the problem." They harvested the block in the afternoon, and that evening Earl boiled a dozen fingerlings and set them on the table with butter and salt and everyone tried them, and the table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when people are surprised by something. Henry's 16-year-old son ate 3 and looked at them with an expression that was purely open, with none of the social calibration that adults bring to new experiences. He just looked surprised and delighted, like he'd been handed something he hadn't known existed. "What do you call this?" he asked. "The Harlan fingerling," Mason said. "It only grows here. It's been here since before anyone at this table was born." The boy looked at the potato in his hand and then at the empty field outside the window, and Mason saw something happen in his face, the arrival of a concept, the idea that a place could hold something irreplaceable, that a valley could have a kind of knowledge. Through the winter Mason built the documentation in earnest. He'd been given the barn office, a small room attached to the barn's west wall with a wood stove that worked intermittently, a desk that had been Earl's father's, and a window that looked out over the south field. He came most mornings now, sometimes arriving at Carol's in the evening and sometimes not, and Carol had noted this shift in Mason's habits without commenting on it, which was itself a comment. He worked through Margaret's notebooks systematically, cross-referencing her observations with Earl's verbal accounts and with the field records he'd been keeping in his own notebooks since September. The seed library he documented digitally, a database he'd built over several weeks, with Earl's explicit and somewhat skeptical approval, with the condition that it was stored locally and not uploaded to any platform without Earl's direct consent. "I've seen what happens when universities get access to data about unique varieties," Earl said. "The data becomes a resource they manage. I'll decide when this information goes anywhere." He had heard about a heritage seed library in Berea, Kentucky, about 90 miles west, run by a woman who had spent 30 years collecting and preserving Appalachian agricultural varieties. He wrote her a letter, an actual physical letter, because Earl had suggested that was more appropriate for the first contact than email, and explained what they were doing and asked whether she knew of any documented accessions of varieties that matched the descriptions in Margaret's notebooks. She wrote back within 2 weeks with 3 cross-references and an invitation to visit. She also, in the postscript, mentioned a variety she called Blue Mountain, a potato with a deep purple skin and a complex flavor profile, that a family in Harlan County had reportedly grown for generations and that she'd never been able to locate a surviving example of. Did he know anything about it? Mason brought the letter to Earl, who read it twice and then sat for a long time. "Blue Mountain," Earl said. "Margaret wrote about that. Said her aunt grew something by that name on the north side of the ridge. Different ground than anything we grow." He paused. "Margaret tried to track it down in the 90s. Couldn't find anyone who still had it." "Do you know the family name?" "Beale," Earl said. "Margaret's aunt married a Beale. There was a woman named Esther Beale who lived on the far side of the county, a fact that Roland knew because Roland knew most things about Harlan County's farming families and had been, since his visits to the farm, increasingly interested in the documentation project. He gave Mason her address and said, "Go with me. She won't talk to you alone." Esther Beale was 82 years old and still working a kitchen garden behind her house. She answered the door in work clothes and looked at Mason with the wariness of someone who has had people come to her door wanting things she wasn't planning to give. "This is Roland Fraley," she said to Roland. Ray Fraley's son? Yes, ma'am, Roland said. She looked at Mason. This is Mason Webb, Roland said. He's doing documentation work with Earl Combs. Earl's wife Margaret. I know who Margaret Combs was, Esther said. Come in. Her kitchen was small and extremely clean. On the counter were 3 jars of canned something and a stack of seed catalogs going back 20 years, which Mason noted were all from small heritage seed companies rather than commercial agricultural suppliers. Esther made coffee without asking if they wanted it and put cups on the table. What do you want to know? She asked. Your family grew a variety called Blue Mountain, Mason said. We're trying to locate a surviving example. A heritage seed library in Berea has been looking for it for 30 years. Esther looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and said, Come here. She led them to a back room that had been set up as a storage space, and on the shelves were rows of Mason jars that made Mason think immediately of Earl's root cellar, the same careful preservation, the same labeled patience. She pointed to a shelf at eye level. 3 jars, deep purple, a label in faded ink, Blue Mountain, Kitchen Garden, 2019. I've grown it my whole life, she said. My mother grew it. Her mother grew it back on the North Ridge before they moved the farm. She looked at Mason with an expression that was equal parts pride and suspicion. What do you do with it if you find it? We document it, Mason said. The genetics, the growing conditions, the history, the flavor profile. We add it to the seed library at Earl's farm. We share the records with the Berea Library so they have a documented accession. He paused. We don't commercialize it. We don't register it or trademark it. We just make sure the information exists so the variety can't simply disappear. Esther looked at Roland. Roland said, Earl Combs' wife Margaret spent 30 years building a seed library. Mason's continuing it. It's serious work. Esther turned back to the jars. She stood looking at them for a long time. Then she opened the jar and placed 3 seed potatoes in Mason's hand. That's for the library, she said. I want to know what you find out about it. I'll write to you, Mason said. Everything we learn. He drove back to Earl's with the 3 seed potatoes in a cloth bag on the passenger's seat and placed them in the root cellar that afternoon next to the Harlan fingerling jars, and then sat at the kitchen table with his notebooks for a long time. Earl came in eventually and poured coffee and sat across from him. Blue Mountain, Mason said. I know, Earl said. He'd been in the barn when Mason came in and Mason had called to him. Esther Beale had it all along. Her family's been growing it on the same property for at least 4 generations. Earl was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have been glad to know that, he said. She tried to find it. She looked for it for years. He wrapped his hands around his mug. Said it was the one that got away. Another pause. She'd be glad it didn't. The spring planting of Mason's second year was different from the first in ways both practical and harder to name. Practically, he now knew the farm as well as anyone could after 18 months of working it, and the preparation and planning proceeded without the constant low-level uncertainty that had characterized everything he'd done his first year. He planted the Harlan fingerling block himself, with Earl supervising from the fence rail and offering corrections that were fewer than they used to be. He planted the Blue Mountain variety for the first time in a small test block on the north side of the ridge, where Earl said the soil mineral composition was closest to what the Beale family's original ridge ground had likely been. The documentation project had grown into something larger than Mason had initially conceived. He'd submitted an application to the Kentucky Heritage Agricultural Foundation for a formal preservation grant in February, and in April he received notice that the application had been approved, $60,000 over 2 years, enough to fund serious genetic analysis, a formal seed library expansion, and, this was the part that had required the most negotiation with Earl, a public catalog of the varieties preserved at the farm, available to agricultural researchers under specific terms that Earl had reviewed and approved line by line. He told Earl about the grant on the porch on a May morning, with the south field just beginning to show the first green of the fingerling emergence, the small purple-tinted leaves pushing up through the mulch, always earlier in that block than anywhere else on the farm. Earl listened. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the south field. $60,000, he said. To preserve what's here. What Margaret built, what you've maintained, what we've found. To do it right. What does right mean? Genetic analysis so we have actual scientific documentation of the uniqueness of the varieties. A formal seed library with redundant storage, copies here and at the Berea Library and at one other location to be determined. A published record that can be referenced by other preservation efforts. He paused. And a community network. Other farms in the county who have varieties worth documenting. We know of at least 6, Roland's Winter White, Esther Beale's Blue Mountain, 3 others that Roland has identified from his grandmother's diary and that he thinks people may still be growing. Earl looked at the field for a while longer. Margaret worked 30 years without $60,000, he said. I know. She worked without any money. She worked because it needed doing. I know, Mason said again. The grant doesn't change what she did or why she did it. It means we can do more of it, faster, and with documentation rigorous enough that it can't be ignored. Another silence. A cardinal was doing something elaborate in the oak tree at the edge of the yard. All right, Earl said. He said it the way he said things that mattered, simply and finally. You run it. I advise. He paused. And Margaret's name is on everything. Yes, Mason said. Of course. The summer of the second year brought the network that Mason had been slowly assembling into something with actual shape. He visited 8 farms in the county over June and July, going always with someone who was known to the family, Roland, or Earl himself when Earl was willing to make the drive, or once with Esther Beale, whose word carried a particular weight in the eastern part of the county. He heard the same story in different forms each time, a variety grown because a parent or grandparent had grown it, maintained by habit and affection rather than deliberate preservation, the grower often assuming that similar varieties existed elsewhere and not quite understanding that what they had might be singular. He added 3 new accessions to the seed library, a dry bean variety with a speckled purple and white skin that a woman named Florence Hatmaker had grown since her grandmother brought it from West Virginia in 1931, a winter squash with a shelf life so extraordinary that Florence's neighbor had stored one for 3 full years and it had still been edible, and a second potato variety from a farm on the county's western edge, this one yellow-fleshed with a thin skin, which the family called simply the Yellow One and which had been grown on that property, as far as anyone could document, since the late 1800s. In August, Dale Whitfield called and asked if he could bring a group of high school students from the county vocational program to the farm for an afternoon. The vocational agriculture program, he explained, was looking for examples of traditional farming practices that were being preserved and adapted, and Earl's operation was, he paused as if choosing words carefully, the best example in the county. Earl said yes, with the condition that they actually work during the visit and not just watch. They came on a Thursday, 11 students and their teacher, a woman named Ms. Alderman who had grown up in the county and whose grandmother had sold potatoes to Earl's parents. The students ranged from genuinely interested to genuinely uncertain about why they were there. Earl put them all to work immediately, not as a demonstration but as actual labor, because there was actual labor to be done, and within an hour the uncertainty had mostly disappeared, replaced by the focus that physical work produces when it's directed clearly. Henry's son was in the group. Mason recognized him from the harvest the previous fall, the boy who had held up the fingerling and looked surprised. He was a year older now and no less direct in his attention. He worked next to Mason for most of the afternoon and asked questions about the documentation project with a specificity that Mason hadn't expected, not the general questions of someone being polite but the particular questions of someone who has been thinking about something and wants to understand it better. How do you know if a variety is unique? He asked. Like actually unique, not just different looking. Genetics, ultimately, Mason said. We can sequence the variety and compare it to databases of known cultivars. If it doesn't match anything in the database, it's at minimum undocumented, and likely unique to the region. He moved a mulch fork to the next plant. But genetics is the last step. The first step is finding it. And for that you need people who know what's in their root cellars and are willing to tell you. How do you get them to tell you? You show up, Mason said. You show up with someone they trust, and you listen more than you talk, and you make it clear you're not trying to take anything. He paused. And you come back. Every time you say you're going to come back, you come back. The boy was quiet for a moment. Mr. Combs said the same thing about you, he said. That you came back every day even when it was hard. Mason glanced over at Earl, who was demonstrating something to Ms. Alderman about soil assessment by feel, and thought about the first weeks at the farm, the spring on the mattress and the too long handshake at the feed store and the voices at the diner table and the hours of mulching and fence repair with almost no words from Earl and almost no sense of whether any of it was leading anywhere. It was hard for a while, Mason said. What made you keep coming back? Mason considered the question honestly, which it deserved. I kept finding things I didn't know, he said. I kept finding out that what I knew wasn't the same as understanding something. And that's uncomfortable, but it's also interesting. Once you get past the discomfort, it's genuinely interesting. He pushed the fork into the next hill. I'd spent a lot of time in environments where I was supposed to be the person who knew things. It was different to be somewhere where I was clearly the person who didn't. That would bother most people, the boy said. It bothered me, Mason said. It bothered me a lot. I just kept coming back anyway. Ms. Alderman, he would learn from Dale later, went back to the school and redesigned a unit on agricultural heritage that she had her students complete by visiting farms in the county and documenting whatever the farmers were willing to share: seed-saving practices, traditional varieties, family farming histories. She sent Mason the results: 12 students, 11 farm visits, and a set of records that turned up 2 additional variety leads that he had not known about. One of them, a dried corn variety that a 90-year-old woman named Cecile Prater had grown for feeding purposes since before the Second World War, turned out to be of genuine botanical interest. The genetic analysis, which Mason processed through the University Extension Lab that Dr. Anand had connected him to, showed it to be distinct from any registered variety in the national database. Cecile Prater, when Mason visited to tell her, looked at the genetic analysis printout with the expression of someone being shown a document in a language they don't read, and then said, "My mother called it the good corn." She said her mother called it the same thing. I always figured everybody's mother called their corn the good corn. Not with this genome, Mason said. She looked at him steadily. What does that mean for me? It means what you've been growing has scientific significance. It means we want to add it to the preservation library and document the full growing history. He paused. It doesn't mean anyone takes anything from you. You keep growing it. We just make sure there's a record, and a backup, so it can't be lost. And you'll write to me, she said. Like you write to Esther Beale. Yes, Mason said. Everything we learn. The paper came together over the winter, written in the evenings at the desk in the barn office with the wood stove working and the south field white with the first frost outside the window. Earl's contributions were in the form of long recorded conversations that Mason transcribed and edited and sent back to Earl for review, and Earl's reviewing was meticulous in a way that reminded Mason of the seed-saving, patient, exacting, nothing left approximate. Dr. Anand contributed the academic framework and the cross-referencing with international research on traditional variety preservation, and in her contributions Mason could see a reflection of what they'd built from the outside, the way an aerial photograph shows the shape of something you can only see partially from within it. The paper's title, after several drafts, Living Seed Libraries, Traditional Variety Preservation as Intergenerational Knowledge Practice in Eastern Kentucky. Earl read the final draft at the kitchen table over 2 mornings. He made 2 corrections, one factual, about the date a particular variety had been introduced to the farm, and one about a characterization of Margaret's notebooks that he said was accurate but insufficient. Mason made both corrections. When Earl was done, he folded the pages and put them in the drawer where he kept things that mattered. Margaret's name is in it, he said. First paragraph of the methods section, Mason said. And the acknowledgments. Earl nodded. He drank his coffee. She would have been uncomfortable with it, he said. She didn't think of what she did as anything notable. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about a few things, Earl said. Not many, but a few. A pause. She'd be glad the Blue Mountain turned up. I'm going to write that in the acknowledgments, Mason said. That the recovery of the Blue Mountain variety is in honor of her 30 years of looking for it. Earl was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. His voice was different, briefly, and then it was the same. Spring planting of the 3rd year. The fingerlings went in first, as always, into the east corner of the south field that suited them like they were born to it, which they were. The Blue Mountain went into the North Ridge test block alongside last year's plants, which had performed well enough to justify the expansion. Roland's Winter White had a dedicated block now. Esther Beale had sent more seed, and a letter with observations about growing conditions she'd collected over 40 years, which Mason added to the documentation with her name and the date. The seed library held 61 accessions. The genetic analyses were complete on 37 of them. The paper was accepted for publication, and the review process had been unusual. Both reviewers had asked substantive questions about the preservation methodology, and one of them had asked to visit the farm, which Earl had agreed to after a week of consideration. The Heritage Foundation had approved a 2nd year of funding and was interested in discussing expansion into neighboring counties, which was a conversation Mason was having carefully and slowly because Earl's caution about institutional involvement was well founded and the expansion, if it happened, needed to be built from the same base as everything else, from farmers who trusted the project because the project had earned it, not because a foundation said it was worthwhile. The fall workshop happened in October, in the barn, which Mason had prepared with tables and the seed library on display, Margaret's notebooks and his own, the jars and their labels, the genetic analysis printouts next to the historical documents. 17 people came, the 12 core farm network members, Ms. Alderman and 2 of her students including Henry's son, Esther Beale and her daughter, and Roland with his grandmother's diary, which he'd framed and hung on the wall of his kitchen but brought for this occasion. Drive, Anand drove from Lexington and presented for 40 minutes on the global context of what they were doing, the rate at which traditional agricultural varieties were being lost worldwide, the concentrated efforts in various countries to document and preserve them, the scientific and cultural significance of what existed in this valley. She was a good presenter, clear and serious without condescension, and the room was attentive in a way that had something to do with the fact that she was talking about their things they had grown and preserved and eaten and saved and handed down, in the language of significance, which some of them had never heard applied to those things before. Earl sat at the edge of the group and said little. When Dr. Anand's presentation was done and the questions began, someone directed one at him, Roland, asking about the fingerling seed saving protocol, a specific question that required specific knowledge, and Earl answered at length, with the complete precision of a man who has thought about a subject for 50 years and has arrived at a description of it that contains no waste. The room was quiet the way rooms are quiet when someone says something that is exactly what it needs to be. Afterward, Mason and Earl stood in the barn in the quiet after everyone had left, the display still on the tables, the seed library jars catching the last light through the west window. "Good day," Mason said. "It was," Earl said. "Dr. Anand wants to write a follow-up paper. A case study on the network model. How we built it, what it's produced, what the replication potential is. With us as co-authors. With us as primary sources. She provides the academic framing, we provide the knowledge. Same structure as the first paper." Earl looked at the jars. "Margaret's name in that one too." "Her name is on everything," Mason said. "That's a standing condition." Earl picked up one of the Harlan fingerling jars from the display, the one from 1989 with Margaret's label, and held it for a moment. He set it back carefully. "I've been thinking about the conservation easement," he said. "Linda and I talked again at Thanksgiving. She'd agree to it under the right terms. Agricultural use in perpetuity, no development, the seed library as a protected element of the property." He paused. "That would need someone to manage the agricultural operation. Over time." He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Mason looked at the south field through the barn window. The harvest was in, the field bare, resting in the November cold. "I'd want to continue the documentation as a formal ongoing project," Mason said. "Not a one-time thing. An active, maintained record that grows as we find new things." "That's what it is," Earl said. "I'd want to expand the workshop program. Make it annual. Bring in the school program, make it a real educational resource." "That's your work," Earl said. "You do it, and I'd want to be clear with the foundation about the terms. Their support doesn't mean their direction. The project stays community-led." "That was always the condition," Earl said. "You drafted it that way." He looked at Mason. "Anything else?" Mason thought about Indianapolis and the spare room and the water stains on the ceiling and the spring in the mattress and everything he'd thought he wanted before he'd known what he actually needed. "No," he said. "That covers it." Earl nodded once. He picked up his jacket from the hook by the barn door. "Spring planting in 5 months," he said. "Fingerlings go in first." "I know," Mason said. "You'll need the desk in here through the winter. Documentation work doesn't stop." "I'll be here," Mason said. Earl put on his jacket and went out into the November evening, and Mason stood in the barn for a while, in the company of the seed library and Margaret's notebooks and 3 years of his own notebooks, all of it in the amber light of the barn's old bulbs, and thought about the question the high school boy had asked, "What made you keep coming back?" The honest answer was several things, layered on top of each other. He had kept coming back because he kept finding out he was wrong about things he'd been confident he was right about, and that, once you got past the sting of it, was one of the more reliable indicators that you were in a place worth being. He had kept coming back because Earl Combs had 50 years of knowledge that was not written down anywhere and that was going to disappear from the world unless someone with the right combination of skills and willingness stayed close enough to receive it, and that seemed like a thing that mattered. He had kept coming back because the Harlan fingerling tasted the way it tasted, and that was not a trivial thing. That flavor was the result of generations of selection and love and attention and specific knowledge of specific ground, and the possibility that it could simply end, simply stop being, because no one had bothered to record what it was, that was a real loss, and he had been in a position to prevent it. And he had kept coming back because the farm had taught him something that his degree had not, something that he was still learning to articulate, that the most durable knowledge is made of relationship rather than data, of presence over time in a specific place, of the willingness to not know things and to learn them slowly and to trust the process of learning even when the process is uncomfortable and slow and occasionally humiliating. He had come to Harlan County with a master's degree and a LinkedIn profile and a set of tools that were genuinely useful, and what the farm had given him was a context in which those tools could actually work, a context he could not have built from a distance, could not have built quickly, could not have built without being wrong regularly and kept at it anyway. He turned off the barn light. Outside the night was clear and cold and the ridge was visible against the darker sky, and somewhere on that ridge the Blue Mountain variety was in the ground for its second winter, the small tubers the same deep purple they'd been in Esther Beale's root cellar jars, carrying in their cells the genetics of a farming family going back to the 1870s, waiting with the patience of things that know how to wait for the ground to warm and the season to turn and the hands that understood them to come back. He locked the barn and walked to his truck. The south field was silver in the starlight. He looked at it for a moment before he got in, the field he'd first seen through morning fog 3 years ago, standing next to Earl who had been looking at something Mason couldn't see. He could see it now. Not all of it, not the way Earl saw it after 50 years, but more of it every season, the field revealing itself to attention the way all things that matter reveal themselves, gradually, with the proof of presence, to the people who stay. He drove home through the Harlan County dark, past the farms of people whose names were now in his notebooks and whose varieties were in the seed library, past the feed store where Dale had extended a handshake with a pause in it and later extended one without, past May's diner where the biscuits were still the best he'd ever eaten and where he now sat sometimes at the Thursday table when there was room, and where the conversation had the quality of a conversation between people who shared a geography and were finding, slowly, the other things they shared. The spare room at Carroll's still had the water-stained ceiling and the spring in the mattress, but he didn't sleep there anymore. He'd tell his parents that the regrouping had become something else, and they would understand, and his father would probably shake his hand again, and this time Mason would know that what his father was feeling was not relief that a setback had been recovered from but recognition that his son had found a place where the work he was doing and the person he was doing it as were the same thing. What he had learned, what the farm had made him learn, slowly and without much ceremony, through soil samples and infected fields and root cellars and kitchen tables and a woman named Margaret whose notebooks were the most careful and loving scientific record he had ever encountered, was this, that knowing about something is not the same as understanding it, and understanding it is not the same as being responsible for it, and being responsible for it is not the same as belonging to it. He had arrived in Harlan County at the first stage. He was somewhere in the middle of the third, which was where the work was and where the work would continue, season by season, in the specific ground of a specific valley, which suited him like he was born to it. He wasn't born to it. He had chosen it, imperfectly and incrementally, one morning at a time. That was different, and better, and entirely enough.